Evelyn Harper arrived at the tiny station in the small southern Colorado town in 1882. The first signs of spring were timidly creeping across the hills, green shoots pushing through the dry, stubborn earth, while the wind carried the crisp scent of pine and wet soil down from the mountains. She held a folded letter tightly in her hands, the name Thomas Baker printed on every page like a promise she clung to, a tether to a life she had imagined but never touched. The station was a weathered shack with a short, creaking bench and a stove blackened with age, offering little comfort against a chill that seeped in through the cracks in the wooden walls. Evelyn approached cautiously, hope wrapped in the folds of her skirt, only to discover that no one in the town had heard of Thomas Baker. The locals glanced at her with polite sympathy, but their eyes told her nothing she could hold on to. She settled on the narrow bench, pulling her coat tighter against the wind, and spent her days watching the rare passenger trains roll past, their wheels kicking up dust that hung in the air like a fragile veil. She ate the last of her stale bread slowly, measuring each bite as if rationing hope itself. The wind tugged relentlessly at her hair and the hem of her dress, as though testing her patience and resolve. Shadows stretched long across the station yard, bending and twisting with the movement of the sun, and Evelyn felt both the weight of the waiting and the loneliness of the empty roads. The occasional passerby would offer a biscuit or a quiet nod, gestures that were warm but fleeting, and she learned to fold herself into the rhythm of stillness and observation. Nights were colder than she had anticipated, the small room inside the station providing little warmth. She curled on the narrow bench, clutching her bag for comfort, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks and the faint, distant call of a night bird. Every train whistle in the distance stirred a flicker of hope, each one carrying the possibility of departure or arrival, though none brought the letter's promised name. Evelyn felt the isolation press around her, a tangible weight that seeped into her bones, yet she remained steadfast, unwilling to leave before discovering the truth of Thomas Baker's existence. On the third morning, the wind had shifted, softer, yet still persistent, carrying the scent of earth and dust from the plains beyond. Evelyn had begun to accept the possibility that her journey might be in vain when a small figure appeared at the edge of the station yard. A little girl, no more than 5, trudged through the dust in boots far too large for her feet, hair braided with grit streaked with weariness. Without hesitation, the child extended her hand to Evelyn and began leading her away from the station, across the empty streets that creaked and rattled under the spring wind. The girl's determination was quiet but insistent, and Evelyn, surprised by the sudden intrusion of life and purpose, allowed herself to be guided toward the house of a widower and his young daughter. Each step carried her further from the station's emptiness and closer to a new rhythm of life, one she had not imagined but now could not refuse, the quiet road stretching behind them like the memory of a past she had left in the dust.
Evelyn saw the ranch for the first time as the girl led her across the uneven yard. The house leaned slightly, its roof sagging under the weight of years and neglect, and the chimney sent a thin wisp of smoke into the early afternoon sky. The kitchen, with its small blackened stove, seemed almost too modest for the lives it sheltered, yet it radiated a quiet resilience. The fence around the property groaned under the wind, its boards weathered and cracked, echoing the long endurance of the land itself. Thomas Baker appeared from the barn, his broad shoulders and worn coat marking years of labor and loss. His face bore deep lines carved by grief and hardship, and his eyes, dark and steady, seemed to carry unspoken sorrows. He paused for a long moment, observing Evelyn without judgment, measuring her presence and intent. Lillian stayed close to her father, small and wary, yet she moved with a cautious curiosity toward Evelyn. The girl's trust came without words, a fragile but immediate connection that eased the tension in Evelyn's chest. She began to follow the rhythm of ranch life, her hands learning the weight of buckets filled with water, the strain of stacking firewood, and the careful precision of mucking out the stalls. Every task required more than physical effort. It demanded patience, attentiveness, and respect for the land and the creatures that depended on it. Evelyn's body ached in ways unfamiliar, muscles pulled and wrists blistered. Yet each exertion rooted her more firmly in the household, connecting her to a routine that was unyielding, honest, and strangely comforting. She moved through the day with quiet determination, sweeping dust from the floors, tending to the small garden, and preparing simple meals with measured care. The stove heat pressed against her face as she stirred porridge and tended to the cooking fire, her hands learning the subtleties of controlling flame and timing. Thomas watched from the shadows of doorways or across the yard, his movements economical and precise, offering guidance through action rather than speech. The silence between them was not cold. It was a shared space, filled with observation, the unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence. Evenings were marked by the golden glow of the sunset spilling across the hills, casting long shadows over the barn and fence, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like a memory. Evelyn paused often to observe, her eyes tracing the contours of the land, the lines of the house, and the subtle gestures of Thomas and Lillian as they moved through their world. The rhythm of ranch life became a steady drum beneath her thoughts, each day building on the last, forming a fragile pattern of trust, endurance, and quiet acceptance. She began to understand that this home, rough-hewn and scarred by hardship, could hold room for her presence, and in the small gestures, the passing of a bucket, the adjustment of a blanket, the placement of a hoof on a restless horse, she found her place in the rhythm of the Baker household.
With each passing day, Evelyn became more essential to Lillian's life. The little girl, who had been quiet and withdrawn at first, now clung to her with a kind of silent devotion. Lillian would slip her small hand into Evelyn's, trusting her without question, her wide eyes seeking comfort in Evelyn's steady presence. The bond between them was simple but profound, formed through gestures and the shared silence of a life lived in close quarters. As Evelyn fed the chickens or mended a fence, Lillian would follow, her steps careful but eager to help in any way she could. Evelyn, in turn, guided her with a patience that had come from months of living on the ranch, a patient, quiet kind of teaching that was more about showing than telling. Thomas, too, had begun to grow accustomed to her presence, though his way of showing it was less overt. He would glance at her when she wasn't looking, studying the way she moved through the house, how she seemed to anticipate the needs of the place before he even spoke. There were no grand gestures of appreciation, only the small, silent acknowledgement that Evelyn had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch. He had seen her care for Lillian, seen how she took on tasks without complaint, and handled them with a quiet grace. It was these subtle acts of care that spoke volumes to him. Their interactions were still slow, and they were often marked by long silences. Evelyn would prepare the evening meal, Thomas would return from the fields, and they would exchange brief nods, simple acknowledgments that passed between them like the wind that swept across the hills. There was no need for words. Their understanding had transcended them. The routine of the ranch had become a language of its own, one that neither needed to speak aloud. In the quiet of the mornings, when the sun was still a pale promise over the horizon, Evelyn would feed the horses and prepare the water troughs, the stillness of the world around her giving her time to think. She had learned the subtle rhythms of the farm, when the cows would need to be rounded up, the time to bring in the firewood, the delicate signs of illness in the animals, the small routines of care that made the place run smoothly. These were the moments where she found her place, not in grand speeches or proclamations, but in these small, quiet acts of service. Thomas began to notice these little things, how Evelyn seemed to know just what was needed before it was said, how she moved through the day with an efficiency that seemed to match his own. There was no clumsiness in her movements, no hesitation in her actions. It was as though she had always belonged here, always known how to work this land, to tend to the animals, to tend to Lillian. Even though the house remained silent, the unspoken communication between them was loud and clear. Evelyn had earned a place in the family, not by force or by asking, but by simply being there, by becoming part of their daily life. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and the ranch settled into the quiet of dusk, Evelyn would sit by the small fire with Lillian, the crackling warmth of the flames casting soft shadows on their faces. Thomas would be nearby, fixing tools or checking the fences, his presence steady but unobtrusive. The house, though small and rough, felt more like a home now, filled with the quiet hum of a family working together, each person fulfilling their role without a word being spoken. Each of them, in their own way, had found their rhythm, and in the silence between them, there was a growing sense of belonging, a shared understanding that this life, this ranch, had begun to weave them into its fabric.
The storm hit without warning, its fury descending on the ranch as though the earth itself had decided to test their resolve. The wind howled through the hills, carrying with it the promise of destruction, while the rain lashed against the roof, the noise deafening. But it wasn't the rain that had them scrambling. It was the fire. The barn, which had once stood solid and reliable, was now consumed by flames, crackling and snapping in the night air. Evelyn, without hesitation, rushed toward the fire, her heart pounding in her chest. The animals were trapped inside, their frantic calls barely audible over the roar of the wind. She didn't think, she just acted. She grabbed a bucket of water from the well and ran, her feet slipping in the mud as the fire spread faster than she could control. The heat was unbearable, the flames casting long, menacing shadows against the walls of the barn. But Evelyn didn't stop. She kept moving, delivering water to the fire and pushing through the panic that threatened to overtake her. Thomas was already there, his face grim as he worked to contain the blaze, his movements efficient despite the chaos. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that glance, there was no need for words. They were in this together. They had no choice but to fight the fire, side by side, until it was under control. Evelyn's hands were raw, her palms burning from the constant contact with the rough buckets, the skin blistering with each movement. She didn't stop, not even when her arms ached and her breath grew shallow. She couldn't afford to stop. There were lives at stake, lives she had grown to care for. Lillian's, the animals, and even her own. The fire had to be put out, and there was no time to spare. As the hours passed, the storm raged on, but the fire slowly began to subside. The barn, though still standing, was heavily damaged. The animals had been rescued, their frightened eyes wide as they were led to safety. But the cost had been high. Evelyn's body was covered in cuts and bruises, and her hands were blistered, the burns stinging as she worked to help salvage what was left of the barn.
Finally, when the fire had been put out and the last of the smoke had cleared, Thomas walked over to her. His face was hard, but there was something new in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his hands gentle despite his rough exterior. Evelyn looked up at him, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but there was no anger, no frustration in her eyes, just the quiet relief of having survived, of having done what was necessary. Thomas didn't say anything. He simply checked her hands, his touch light, careful, as he inspected the burns. It was the first time she had seen him show such tenderness, and though the words were unspoken, they hung heavy between them. He didn't need to say anything. The quiet concern in his actions spoke volumes. He cared, in his own way, in the way that he could. And Evelyn, for her part, knew she had crossed a line. She was no longer just a guest in his home, no longer an outsider. She was part of this family, in every way that mattered. The bond between them had deepened in the most unexpected of ways. It wasn't just about the work they did together, the way they had shared the responsibility of saving the ranch. It was in the quiet moments that followed, the way Thomas had touched her hand, the way Evelyn had held herself through the ordeal. There were no promises, no grand declarations, but there was something stronger than words between them now. As the storm finally began to die down, the winds died to a whisper, and the rain softened into a gentle mist. The ranch was still standing, though battered, and in the silence that followed, there was a sense of something new, something fragile but real. Evelyn and Thomas stood together, looking at the damage, but in that moment, the world felt a little smaller, a little more manageable. They had survived this storm, together, and that was enough for now.
Life settled back into its slow rhythm after the storm, yet the house felt different, charged with a quiet tension that had not been there before. Evelyn moved through the rooms with purpose, attending to Lillian's needs, mending clothes, preparing meals, and tending to the small chores that kept the ranch running. Each action was measured and thoughtful, a reflection of the care she had come to feel for the child and the household. Her presence became indispensable, not through words or declarations, but through the steady constancy of her efforts and the gentle way she anticipated the family's needs before they were spoken. Thomas watched her quietly, sometimes from the edge of the fields, sometimes in the doorway of the kitchen. His gaze lingered on her in moments too brief to be noticed, tracing the lines of her hands as she worked, the careful way she moved about the house, and the patience she displayed with Lillian's boundless energy. Small gestures became their unspoken conversation. He allowed her to take the lead in certain tasks, giving her space to settle into the rhythm of ranch life, while silently acknowledging her contributions. A bucket of water left at just the right place, a fire perfectly stoked, a stall swept and ready. These became expressions of their growing understanding. Evelyn felt the change as well, sensing Thomas's quiet acknowledgement and the ease with which Lillian had begun to lean on her. She had arrived a stranger, a visitor with uncertain purpose, and now she was part of the household, woven into the fabric of daily life. She took solace in the familiarity of the routines, the soft early mornings when the sun touched the hills, the smell of oats and hay, the quiet hum of activity before the fields demanded attention. The house no longer felt like a stop on a journey, but a place where she was rooted, where leaving was not only unnecessary but unthinkable. Their connection grew in these ordinary moments, through shared responsibility and the tacit understanding that each was there for the other, for Lillian, and for the home they were shaping together. Trust was built silently in the rhythm of their days, in the careful management of chores, and the protective attention given to the little girl who had unknowingly guided Evelyn into their lives. Neither rushed nor forced the development of their feelings. Love had not been spoken aloud, yet it thrived quietly in the spaces between words, in the steady gaze, in the touch of a hand while passing a plate, in the shared labor of survival and care. By the end of the week, Evelyn no longer considered herself a guest or a temporary helper. She was anchored in the small domestic victories and the growing affection that could not be dismissed. The bond that had begun as necessity and compassion had grown into something more profound, a silent promise that she could no longer ignore. She belonged here, not by obligation but by choice, and the idea of leaving, once possible, had faded entirely. The house, the ranch, the child, and the man who had slowly let himself be seen in moments of quiet vulnerability had become her world, and her decision to stay was as natural as the turning of the seasons, inevitable and complete.
Evelyn had fully settled into the rhythm of ranch life, no longer an outsider, but a vital part of the household. Thomas entrusted her with responsibilities he once reserved for himself, allowing her to make decisions about the care of the animals, the garden, and the upkeep of the house. Her presence brought a sense of order and calm that the home had not known since the loss that had shadowed Thomas and Lillian. Each morning she moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, lighting the stove, preparing breakfast, and setting out the simple routines that marked the start of the day. Lillian followed her example,
trusting in the stability Evelyn provided, and the little girl's laughter and chatter became the soundtrack of a home slowly mending itself. Thomas observed the changes around him with a new kind of attention. He had learned to step back, to allow Evelyn the space to shape their life together, and in doing so, he found a sense of peace he had thought was lost forever. The small gestures of family life, sweeping the floors, filling the water trough, tending to the horses, took on new meaning as they became shared acts of care. In the quiet evenings, he would notice Evelyn moving through the dimly lit kitchen, brushing flour from her hands, or tucking a stray curl from Lillian's face, and feel the warmth of connection without needing to speak. Words had become unnecessary. Trust, respect, and the steady presence of one another carried the weight of their bond. Spring arrived slowly over the hills, carrying the promise of renewal. Evelyn discovered she was expecting a child, and this knowledge brought with it a gentle, profound sense of hope. The ranch, once just a place of work and endurance, now became a cradle for the next chapter of their lives. Each day, the family moved together in quiet harmony. Evelyn attended to Lillian with the tender care of a mother. Thomas worked alongside her in the fields and barns, and the little routines of cleaning, feeding, and preparing meals took on the rhythm of a household that had learned to thrive through patience and devotion. Every chore, every shared moment became a building block of family life, grounding them in the reality of love that was shown through deeds rather than words. The bonds between them grew stronger with each passing day. Evelyn's hands, once blistered and weary from learning the hard work of the ranch, now moved with practiced ease, carrying warmth and care to those around her. Thomas, whose grief had once been a barrier, allowed himself to witness the comfort and joy she brought into their home, recognizing that his heart could open again, slowly, carefully, without fear. Lillian, who had first approached Evelyn with curiosity and tentative trust, now clung happily to her side, secure in the presence of two adults whose lives had intertwined through patience and understanding.
Together, they embraced the subtle, unspoken joys of everyday life. Morning light falling across the kitchen table, the smell of fresh bread and coffee, the rhythm of chores completed in unison, and the quiet satisfaction of a barn well tended, all became the markers of a family that had found each other against the odds. The knowledge of Evelyn's pregnancy added a layer of anticipation and shared responsibility, deepening the sense of connection between them. Their love did not need grand gestures. It grew naturally in the warmth of shared work, the care of a child, and the promise of new life yet to come. In the evenings, the family gathered in the soft glow of the hearth, the firelight flickering across faces filled with trust and contentment. Thomas would sit nearby, watching Evelyn attend to Lillian or arrange the evening meal, feeling the profound gratitude of having someone steadfast by his side. Evelyn, feeling the first gentle reminders of the life growing within her, moved with a quiet determination, embracing her role as partner, caregiver, and soon-to-be mother. Lillian's laughter echoed through the house, a reminder that life continued, healing wounds and weaving their hearts together in ways that words could never fully capture. The ranch had transformed from a house of endurance into a home of love, care, and quiet devotion. Each day, Evelyn, Thomas, and Lillian built their life together with patience, respect, and the steady acts of devotion that made a family. The coming months promised new challenges and joys, yet they faced them united, grounded in the certainty of their bond and the home they had created together. Their love was slow, steady, and real, manifesting in every meal prepared, every chore completed, and every moment spent together under the vast Colorado sky. They were a family, whole and anchored, awaiting the arrival of a new life that would carry their devotion forward, a testament to patience, resilience, and the power of quiet love. Subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales to follow more slow, heartwarming stories of love, family bonds, and the unexpected homes we find in the places we least expect.